Please welcome Jim back.
Woo! Okay.
How's this? Okay. As Rick just said, I've been pretty deeply involved with IRIS over the last, 8 or 9 years. So I've gotten to know a lot of refugees. I have friends, Kurdish friends from Syria, although they'd say Kurdistan. I have my friend who Rick just mentioned from Sudan. I've got Pashtun friends from Kandahar. I've got Dari-speaking friends from other parts of Afghanistan. So I've met a lot of people and I've heard a lot of their perspectives. And that's what I'm talking about today is an interview that I heard on Al Jazeera English with Dr. Erikana Shihimbori Kwao. She's an MD. She's the former permanent representative of the African Union to the United States. And she was interviewed about the closure of USAID. And I think her perspective and the perspective of the refugee friends that I have is quite a bit different than the perspective of most Democrats or the perspective of most Republicans regarding that organization. So I'll start with bringing up the key points of the interview. Her first statement was that USAID enters countries acting as if their sole purpose is to rescue Africa, to fill gaps, promote human rights, protect the environment, support democracy, and then they use this deep access to constantly destabilize governments. When asked about the education and the health care they provide, she says, if they're so successful, show me one African country where health care and education has improved with their help. When she asks about agriculture, and this is something that's well known and has been since the 80s when it regards agriculture in the developing world. USAID will go in, as the Peace Corps would, and convince farmers to abandon indigenous crops and replace them with higher yielding GMOs that exhaust the soil and make the farmers dependent on herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers necessary to grow them. Another statement she says is the average African government can afford to provide the services that USAID gives them. That's true because the amount of money that actually ends up in these countries is what she says is peanuts. Most USAID money goes towards different causes. Another thing she says is Europe's economy couldn't survive without Africa. Through the colonial exploitation of Africa's resources, Africa's contribution to the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II, far exceeded the financial contribution of the United States. When it comes to America first, she says it's a sentiment that Africa needs to adopt. Africa needs to unite and put Africa first. Africa is hampered by the legacy of colonialism and Christian missionaries who convinced generations of African leaders that they can only succeed with the help of white people. Africa needs to exit the United Nations. The United Nations was created after World War II to perpetuate colonialism. It was created to steal from Africa. And a proof of that is the United Nations Security Council, which is the only body of the UN that can pass a binding resolution. The 5 members of the Security Council with veto power are the current colonial powers: the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. So that was her interview. And then when what my friend from Sudan was going to talk about today, he can't. So I referenced a book called What is the What? It's the autobiography of Valentino Achek Deng. When Deborah Amos from NPR came to my warehouse during COVID, did a story for Morning Edition, and she interviewed a couple of the guys that work for me. And she recommended this book, and I finally got around to reading it. But two of the statements in the book are pertinent to what I'm discussing. One is about the Kakuma refugee camp, it's in the northwest corner of Kenya, and it's where Achek pretty much spent his adolescence and his young adulthood before he came to the United States. And Kakuma's out in the middle of nowhere. And he's like, why place Kakuma where it is? Do not think it was lost on us that the Kenyans and every international body that monitors or provides for the displaced customarily place their refugees in the least desirable regions on earth. There we become utterly dependent, unable to grow our own food, to tend our own livestock, to live in any sustainable way. And that dependence is pretty much how the United States and other China and everyone else exploits their influence, that dependence on their aid. Another thing he said is aid bait, we're sometimes called. 20,000 unaccompanied boys in the middle of the desert. It's not difficult to see the appeal to the UN to save the children and the Lutheran World Federation. Chris Murphy, when USAID's office were being shut in Washington, he went to the protest. And it's very telling what his defense of USAID was. He made three statements. USAID fights terrorist groups all over the world by addressing the underlying causes of terrorism. USAID chases China all over the world by securing American control of critical minerals and port infrastructure. USAID supports freedom fighters everywhere in this world. None of those statements have anything to do with aid. Freedom fighters, to those of us who lived through the Reagan administration, we know what that is. A freedom fighter, it's the Cold War catchphrase for a right-wing insurgency. It's applied to any armed group fighting a government that the U.S. opposes. These groups are never democratic since they're almost always organized along ethnic lines. In Washington backrooms, USAID and other aid groups supported by the U.S. government are known as the aid industrial complex. That and the military industrial complex carry a lot of clout with Congress. Knowing this, it's not surprising that according to Congressional Research Service, Ukraine was the top foreign recipient for USAID in 2023. Knowing this, it's not surprising after his 25-hour speech largely supporting the aid industrial complex, Cory Booker almost immediately supported the military industrial complex by voting against Bernie Sanders' effort to stop the transfer of $8.8 billion in weapons to Israel. Thankfully, Chris Murphy joined 13 other Democrats in support of Bernie's measure. I've already sent him a thank you, and I recommend anyone who supports Bernie Sanders does, because that's a small glimmer of hope. And if you could listen to what I'm saying, you might think I'm misinformed. You might agree with me, or you might think I'm misinformed or naive and at some level a Trump supporter, but I'm not. But for that reason, I'm going to sum up with an example from popular culture. Have you ever seen the movie Avatar? In writing the movie, James Cameron references the same colonial formula that was used in Dances with Wolves. Profit-driven Westerners encounter an indigenous people who are living on lands with vast resources. In Avatar, the first thing the Earth people do is send in human scientists led by Sigourney Weaver. These USAID types, who genuinely think they are doing the right thing, set up schools and medical clinics, and do everything they can to integrate themselves with the native society. This takes place in the future, so scientific research has replaced Christianity as their primary motivation. If Cameron had more time, he may have had Sigourney Weaver teach the Na'vi how to plant sweet potatoes. Her efforts are funded by the corporation and monitored by the military. The movie starts with circumstances requiring a Marine named Jake Sully to take the place of one of the scientist aid workers. He's an outlier and quickly is adopted by the Na'vi and learns their ways. At first he is loyal to his military superiors, but learns that the indigenous people are the good guys and switches his loyalties to them. When the corporation and military use knowledge that he had provided them with to destroy the Navi's home because of the minerals located under it, he launches an armed revolt against his own people. And for the sake of a great movie, he's successful. I wonder if Dr. Shiembori Kwao has seen Avatar. What the movie shows is that Americans are fully aware of how modern colonialism works. We, if we think about it, are fully aware of the real purpose of USAID. Of course, she would also immediately point out the arrogance of the idea that the Navi needed a white guy to save them. The United States has been using USAID to act out Avatar with the world. Who knows what Donald Trump's motivation is in shutting down an organization which helps enrich his oligarch friends? A surprising fact from Forbes is that USAID partnered with Elon Musk's SpaceX by providing 5,000 Starlink terminals to Ukraine in 2022. What we do know, if we think about it, is that until the educated half of this country who didn't vote for Trump educate themselves about what our government has been quietly supporting, that we need to educate ourselves about what our government has been quietly supporting for generations. When it comes to IRIS, I did, in fairness, I should say, I've had a parting of ways with IRIS. And I spoke to Maggie about it. And the reason is, I've spent all these years dedicating my time. I've hired refugees. I've done a lot for them. And on the day of their run for refugees back in February, it was on Super Bowl Sunday, I had spent days of my time driving around, getting the water delivered to my warehouse, getting the food that they needed, all that stuff. And so when I was there that morning, I had to shovel off the roof of my truck because it snowed that morning to get there. I got there early. And so I'm walking around, and my sister-in-law comes up to me, and she's like, Dick Blumenthal's here. And I had pointed out 3 days earlier, Dick Blumenthal proudly had his picture taken with Benjamin Netanyahu, a man who is wanted as a war criminal in 125 countries. Dick Blumenthal had his picture up there with him and Chuck Schumer and Susan Collins. It was like a mafia shot. You had Benjamin Netanyahu in the middle of them all. And I was like, there is no way on earth that Dick Blumenthal is going to show his face at IRIS this year. Because how could he? I mean, he's on the cusp of creating one of the greatest refugee crises of the century. He's right up there standing with a man who wants to turn Gaza into a resort. And so I couldn't. So then I said, "How could he be here?" And then there he was, up on stage, with a real hero, the mayor of New Haven, New Haven's an asylum, or what do they call it, a sanctuary city. He's up there taking his picture with Maggie, and I asked Chris George, Chris, how could he be here? Last year he didn't show up because he was one of the things he was doing was voting to defund UNRWA, the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, and that's what they were doing last year at this time. They, in addition, one of the parts of the bill that sent to send weapons to Israel and Ukraine that last winter part of it was to defund UNRWA, which is the only refugee organization that works with Palestinians. How could somebody like that? I said, Chris, how could he be here? He works against refugees. And he's like, oh, I'll have to talk to him about that. And then Maggie called me a couple days later, and I'm like, Maggie, I can't do it. I work with people. I work with the refugees. They're friends of mine. I can't be there when this guy when you're standing and taking your picture with somebody who 3 days earlier was proudly taking his picture with Benjamin Netanyahu. And so that's something that I mean, if you want something that's at the core of why the Democrats lost. It's not the ignorance of the Trump supporters. It's the knowledge of the people like me who couldn't bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris or Joe Biden if he happened to be the candidate. I voted for Dr. Jill Stein because she's the only candidate that was calling what was going on in Gaza a genocide. And she was the only candidate who was standing up to, who would have, if she got elected, standing up to that. And so when there are intelligent, educated people that really can't vote for either one of the people that we're debating on. Like, Donald Trump's a bad guy, I get it, but that's where this has brought me. And USAID is not a great organization, and there's people around the world who are celebrating its end, and to just oppose what's going on without, I mean, I agree. The methodology for it ending is the wrong methodology, but it doesn't mean that it's a wonderful organization. Okay, thanks.